What's up guys, Manny here, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another lesson about rock climbing technique. Today we're gonna take a look at the pros, cons and applications of static and dynamic climbing styles. So let's jump right into it. This topic is quite often discussed in the climbing community, and the general consensus seems to be that a dynamic climbing style is always better than a more static climbing style. Well, I can tell you right away that, and I've mentioned this before, climbing is a very complex sport from a mechanical point of view, and there is rarely something which is always better than something else. Rather, it is the case that different styles and different techniques have their unique strengths and weaknesses, and you as a climber have to pick and choose them intelligently, depending on which problem you're facing. The most popular argument in favor of a dynamic climbing style is that it is more energy efficient. In order to check if that is true, let's quickly go over the definitions of static and dynamic by taking a look at a few example moves. For this purpose, I will try to deconstruct a standard climbing move into 4 different stages. Firstly, we've got acceleration, where usually still both hands are in contact with the wall. Secondly, we've got reaching over, where usually only the holding hand is still in contact with the wall and the reaching hand is getting closer to the target hold. And thirdly, we've got the phase of gripping the target hold, during which the gripping hand, the reaching hand, actually tries to get control over the next hold and get back into contact with the wall. And finally, we've got the stage of repositioning of feet, after which everything starts again. These stages are very distinguishable on a static move, which is why I showed you a static style here. But let's analyze this once again from the perspective of energy output and other aspects, comparing both styles, and maybe we can find some pros and cons. Starting with the static style climber on the left side, we can see that he has to put a relatively low strain on his muscles during the phase of acceleration, because he's not really accelerating, he's not really going for high speed or momentum, he just merely pulls himself into a position from which he thinks that he can reach the target hold statically. The dynamic style climber on the right side puts a little more force into his hands, however, because he has to go for this momentum, he wants to reach a high speed, he actually has to accelerate, and when we take a look at this from the side, we can see that this force does not only come from his hands and arms, but also from lower parts of the body like hips and legs. And in fact, here we have yet another exception of the so popular rule, put your center of gravity always as close to the wall as possible, because as you can see, when we're generating momentum, we can also have a little phase of creating some distance to the wall, and then only afterwards, when you're actually moving, closing the gap again, pushing those hips to the wall again. During the second phase of reaching over, a high force has to be taken by the holding hand of the static climber, because the reaching hand is already occupied with moving closer to the target hold and cannot support that holding hand any longer. In the dynamic climber, only a low force has to be taken by the holding hand, since moving closer to the target hold happens merely due to the momentum which has been generated beforehand during the phase of acceleration. During the third phase, gripping of the target, we can see that not a lot of force has to be caught by the reaching hand of the static climber, because he reaches the target hold at a relatively low speed, and thus there is a lot of time to get control over this target hold, since there is still a lot of support from the holding hand below. In the case of the dynamic climber, a relatively high force has to be caught by the reaching hand during the process of gripping the target hold, because he reaches the target hold at a relatively high speed, and there is only little time to get control over this target hold, because there is not much support coming from the holding hand below, which means that if he doesn't grab the target hold in time, his whole body is going to fall back down again. In climbing, there is a separate term for this very specific type of finger strength which is needed to literally catch a target hold in a dynamic fashion, and this is called contact strength. And contact strength can actually be trained very effectively on the campus board. Speaking of the campus board, the difference between a static and a dynamic climbing style can be very well visualized on the campus board, and in fact it's actually a quite useful tool to find out which type of climber you are, because most climbers will very quickly fall into one of these two patterns after hitting the campus board for the first time, which I would not necessarily recommend for beginners, by the way. Alright, so let's try to sum up the pros and cons here real quickly. The main advantages of performing a move in a static fashion are that you have a relatively low effort in the acceleration phase and that you have lots of time and therefore control over the gripping process of the reaching hand. Disadvantages are a very high force and therefore energy output in the holding hand during the phase of reaching over, but also during the phase of gripping the target. Not only in its fingers, but also in the arm, the upper arm especially, and the whole upper body actually, because the position has to be locked off. Another thing which people often forget is that a static move simply takes a little bit more time than a dynamic move. So all this together sums up to a very high energy output. In the dynamic case, it is just the other way around. Advantages are a relatively low strain on the holding hand during the phases of reaching over and gripping the target, and a dynamic move is somewhat quickly performed, which saves time and therefore even more energy. Disadvantages are a somewhat higher effort in the acceleration phase and the demand for contact strength in the gripping hand due to less time and therefore less control over the gripping process. Now, just this comparison alone already tells us a lot about the potential applications of these two styles. In terms of energy efficiency, I can definitely confirm that usually a more dynamic climbing style is more energy conserving and therefore preferable. Although we have to view this in the context of the problem we are facing again, because we are essentially trading lock of power of the holding hand against contact strength of the reaching hand. And let's say we've got a problem, we've got a lot of moves, couple of clippings here, and all the clippings are from the right hand. However, in the crux we've got a move on the right hand, on reaching a target hold with the right hand. You will probably go for a static solution in this case, because it increases the chance for you hitting this hold and properly sorting your fingers in and stuff immensely. And that's what I mean, you have to view it in the context of the problem. So let's take a look at a few more examples. Let's assume you've got a climb with lots of tiny little pockets where you have to nestle your fingers in order to be even able to hold them. If you decide, man, I want to unleash my dino skills now, and you're jumping to these pockets, you will probably not hit them properly because you don't have enough control over the gripping process and you will probably fall off. Another practical example would be when you don't even know what your next hold is going to feel like because you're in an on-site or flash and you basically only see a white spot in front of you. If you have the power left, you will probably go for a more static solution to make sure that you have enough time to sort your fingers in correctly into that next hold. If you were a smart climber, however, then you probably would have inspected the route from the bottom rigorously so that you know which moves you can probably do dynamically in order to save some energy. However, don't make the mistake to believe that dynamic moves come at no cost and are, so to say, always the easier moves from a physical point of view. There are holds out there which are so bad that you probably can't grab them in a dynamical contact strength fashion, but you maybe would be strong enough to grab them in a static fashion. It's always easy to hop to a big sloper or a big jug, but when you hop to a super strangely shaped pinch or pocket, things are a little bit different. Of course, it must be added here that by practicing a dynamic climbing style, not only your contact strength but also your aim and accuracy will get better, thereby increasing your chance of sticking dynamic catches significantly. And another thing that I would like to add is that there are not only the pure static and the pure dynamic moves, there are also all kinds of mixtures between the two. Some moves start off quite statically and have a slight dynamic hap at the finish, and some start off quite dynamically and all of a sudden you have to lock off this position to kind of sort your fingers in properly or something like that. So don't limit yourself to the purity stuff, also take into account that there can be mixtures. Finally, I'd like to add that just as there are certain moves which are very hard to perform in a dynamic fashion, or at least very luck dependent, there are certain moves which are completely impossible to do in a static fashion, namely those where the target hold is simply out of reach. One of the major advantages of a dynamic move is that it increases actually your reach, and this can come in quite handy sometimes. But we're gonna take a look at the specific topic of dynos in another episode. To conclude, as always in climbing, you can't really say that one style is superior or one technique is superior. You rather have to know the strengths and weaknesses of each style and each technique and apply them intelligently depending on the problem you're facing. And when you're facing big open problems, compression problems with big moves, then a dynamic climbing style will definitely get you further, of course. Another thing is when you know all the moves of your project, for example, like the back of your hand already, and you're simply always falling on that last crux move, it can be the dynamic climbing style actually, which can save you a lot of energy along the way and maybe enable you to pull through that crux. Because remember, when you can save a little bit of energy on 20 moves, on every single move of 20 moves, it's gonna sum up to quite a lot, and it might enable you to simply easily pull through that crux all of a sudden. And now we're getting into the territory of fast climbing, which is very closely related to a dynamic climbing style, but actually also demands its own video. If you, on the other hand, need more control over the gripping process, maybe because you don't even know the shape of your target hold, or maybe you know it has a super strange shape, or maybe you're already super exhausted in your reaching hand, or maybe you're always losing your feet when you're doing it in a dynamic fashion, in which case you probably should work on your body tension, then a more static approach might increase your chance for success. One last thing, it is actually often fear of falling which pushes especially outdoor climbers in a more static climbing style, which is no wonder, because who wants to give up control in a very scary situation? Despite that, try to not get too pushed into a too static climbing style. In my experience, a lot of climbers, or the majority actually of climbers, would benefit from a more dynamic climbing style. So try to go for the one or the other scary dyno, even if you're a little bit above your last clipped bolt. It's not that dangerous if you get belayed correctly, and it's so rewarding if you stick it. And that's already it for this technique episode. I sincerely hope that you've got something from it. If you did, please drop some likes and opinions down below. It helps a lot. And until then, guys, stay strong, stay versatile, and I'll see you soon. Bye.